Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Richard Schifter, a U.S. Army veteran of World War II who served as one of the Ritchie Boys, which engaged in psychological warfare and in interrogations in the European theater of World War II. Mr. Schifter later served the United States as a diplomat, holding several different roles at the United Nations and State Department. And sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Nice to be here.
You were born in Austria in 1923, and of course the Anschluss took place in 1938. Were there major signs of trouble even before that?
Well, discrimination was a matter, but the really dangerous period started on what I still remember, the evening of March 11th, 1938.
Tell us about it.
What happened was that my father and mother and I were having dinner. My father had heard that a very important speech was going to be delivered, or a statement was going to be delivered on radio. We had the radio on, and solemn music was being played, and then there was an announcement that the Austrian Chancellor, his name was Kurt Schuschnigg, was about to speak. Then he delivered a speech in which he explained that he had received an ultimatum from Germany, that he was supposed to surrender to Germany, and that he decided to do just that. The German army was crossing the border within hours, and then he ended up with the statement, German, God protect Austria.
Now you, of course, were in a Jewish family, and what did that mean for you?
We were fully aware, right then and there, that we had to emigrate. And my father said right that evening that he was going to be in touch with his uncle in New York to get the ball rolling for the immigration of the family.
But it wasn't as smooth as he hoped, right?
No, it was not. It was possible for me to get the visa because I was born in Austria. It was not possible for my parents, who were on the Polish quota, and that was clear that the waiting period would be a number of years, and they just never made it. They died in the Holocaust.
What was that journey like for you? How did you get to America?
Well, I got my visa in November 1938. My parents took me, I still remember, on December 4th to the Western Railroad Station in Vienna. Took the train to Rotterdam, and then in Rotterdam I waited a few days until I got on a boat, the New Amsterdam, which sailed for let me see now, where did we land? It was in New Jersey someplace. It is in Port of New York, and we arrived on December 15th, 1938. And I still remember very distinctly being on the deck and looking at this Statue of Liberty. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing is that the New York Times the following day printed a picture of all these refugees who had arrived looking at the Statue of Liberty, and there, from the back, I appear in the New York Times picture.
It's quite an arrival.
Yeah.
So at this point, you're about 15 years old?
Yes.
And you lived with family then? Or who did you live
with? With my father's uncle, with my great uncle and his wife, yes.
Okay. And when did you ultimately join the Army?
In May 1943.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Drafted.
Okay.
I, as a non-citizen, enlistment was not a possibility. But as a matter of fact, what I made sure is that I finished college before I sort of anticipated getting drafted.
Right.
Made sure that I took extra courses during the year, and then additional went to summer school, and was able to graduate from college in 3 years.
What was your reaction when the United States went to war with Germany, the country that had forced you out of your home?
Well, I had gotten very much engaged in learning about U.S. politics at the time, and I was a strong supporter of the Roosevelt administration, which was supportive of a foreign policy that resisted the Nazis.
So after you're drafted, did they send you directly to Camp Ritchie?
No.
Okay.
I went first to I first got my infantry basic in Camp Fannin, Texas. That is where I went. And as a matter of fact, what had happened at that time was that the Army had started the planning of the Specialized Training Program, Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP. And the unit, is the group that was with me, our company in Camp Fannin, was all either college graduates or students, college students. So that was our group in Camp Fannin, getting the usual infantry basic. And as I've looked back at it, I never was in better physical shape than I was when I was finished with these 3 months at Camp Fannin.
I bet.
Then I went to, because I was in the Army Specialized Training Program, I went to Stanford University, and we had the program there for these various people who had been selected for the Army Specialized Training Program. And I was being trained for what might have been the occupation of what was then called the Dutch East Indies. It's now Indonesia. So I was being trained to start with in learning the Dutch language. And I remember that as I spoke both English and German, and Dutch is somewhat in between, I really learned it very fast. And I was quite fluent in Dutch. As a matter of fact, when the Crown Princes of the Netherlands arrived at Stanford University to come to our class, I was the one that was selected to greet her in Dutch.
Wonderful.
So that was my experience there. And we learned a lot about history and geography of East Asia. It was basically, we were all being prepared for a war in East Asia, ultimately. And it was then, I got there in probably September, October 1943. And then in December, I received notice that there was somebody from the Pentagon who had arrived and wanted to interview me. And in person. I met with somebody from the Pentagon who asked me a few questions about my knowledge of German, and then said, well, your time at Stanford University is coming to an end. You will be going to Camp Ritchie. And then he added, and you'll be in the wars sooner than many others. And so I had my orders to go to Camp Ritchie, left Stanford University, when I think I had initial leave, and then reported to Camp Ritchie in January 1944. And there was in the Ritchie training program for interrogators of prisoners of war. And what we did was learn a lot about the organization of the German army, really got to know the order of battle, a lot of things that we were being taught, so that we would be prepared to ask the appropriate questions. And then we were also being taught how to interrogate, how to handle the situation in terms of what to do when people did not want to talk. The idea was never to use force, but we were specifically instructed not to use force, but to see whether one can somehow move the discussion to the point where the prisoners who would be interrogated would feel comfortable about it. The one thing that we were informally told was, if somebody doesn't want to talk, what you may want to do is tell them that you'll send them to the Soviet Union, and they'll talk. And sure enough, a few months later, I had exactly that kind of experience.
You got the chance to prove it.
Yes.
Mr. Schifter, let's hold the conversation right there. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by Richard Schifter, a U.S. Army veteran of World War II, a member of the Ritchie Boys, and later a United States diplomat. And sir, you had just talked about your training for interrogation. Let's talk about your deployment now. When did you head to Europe?
It was in end of June 1944, arriving there in July.
So just after D-Day? A few weeks
Yes.
after D-Day?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And where were you sent?
First to England, and as a matter of fact, actually we landed in Scotland and then went by train to a place called Broadway, where the Ritchie Boys were assembled. And it was rather interesting. I still remember when we arrived at Broadway, we were told to get off it, and we heard somebody, there was a sergeant there, who shouted to everyone with a very heavy German accent, "Everybody fall in." And we knew we were in the right place. So it was in Broadway, and we had our first experience. We were being given opportunity to do some interrogations, and then I also went to London for a further training program in the order of battle, bringing us completely up to date. And I was in London during the air raids.
Wow.
Including the the firing of the missiles of V-1s.
When did you have your first interrogation, and what was it like?
Well, the first interrogation was we were being sent to a nearby prisoner of war camp in England, where newly arrived prisoners of war from Normandy were being held. And I still remember when I interviewed the very first person. I should interview somebody who, when gave me his name, and then asked for his army unit, didn't answer. I asked again, didn't answer. Asked a third time, didn't answer. So I then did what we were told informally at Camp Ritchie. I called somebody and I said, for our next shipment to the Soviet Union, here's another name. And I started spelling out his name. At that point he said in German, 4th Paratroop Division. What else do you want to know?
So that really was the magic phrase.
It was. And we never sent anyone, this was just a threat. Yeah.
So is that pretty much the key to getting everyone to talk then, or did some people
All
talk
I can
willingly?
tell you is that was my experience. This was the only one. And then later on, I was very much involved in interrogating civilians, and that was less of a problem there. People were free to talk.
Describe that process, because obviously you can't threaten to send them to Russia, so how'd you get them to talk? Although they were not Germans most of the time, they were living under Nazi occupation, right?
I'm sorry?
The civilians you talked to.
Oh, they had been living, yeah, but it was amazing. Well, I have one very important story I can tell in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I?
Sure.
Go ahead? Okay. It was, I was in Aachen, then the city that we had occupied, 1st Infantry. We had been attached to the 1st Infantry Division. And what had happened was that the commanding general had been concerned about a threat that had come from Hitler personally, which he said that civilians will be engaged in fighting the Army of Occupation, and that we had to be. And our commanding general, General Hubner, 1st Infantry, then decided that what we need to do is check out civilians to make sure that everything is okay among them. So we did that, and very systematically throughout all those that had not fled. There were about, I would think, about 20,000 that had remained. So from early in the morning to late at night, we were interviewing civilians. And the one case of all these cases of interviews that was very special was the following. Somebody came, escorted to my desk. The form had been filled out, so his name and address. And my first question was, what's your occupation? And explained it was engineer. And all of this was, of course, conversation in German. And the next was, well, where do you work? So at that particular point, he used a very important word. He said in Peenemünde. Now, what I knew was that Peenemünde was a place in East Germany near the Baltic Sea, and that is where the Germans did all their initial work to prepare missiles, long-range missiles. And the V-1 was the first one, and then they worked on the V-2. By that time, the V-2 had also been completed and was being fired at our forces in Europe. So when he said it was Peenemünde, I made sure that I was going to be very calm in terms of talking further to him, and I said, well, how come you are here in West Germany when you are working in East Germany? And what he then explained to me was that he had some leave coming, and he had relatives in Western Germany, and he decided to go spend some time with the relatives. And then he said, and then you people were coming closer, and I want the war to be over, so I decided I would just stay here and await your arrival. So I thought that was rather significant. So we talked a little bit further about his staying in Western Germany. It was clear to me at that particular point that what was really happening here. He was running away from the Russians. And so as we continued with our conversation, I then said, well, how is our bombing doing in Peenemünde? So I said, well, you hit some, you missed some. So I said, will you be willing to sketch this out for me? So I thought about it for a while, and then he said, I want the war to be over. Yeah, I'll do it. So I handed him a piece of paper and a pencil, and he started drawing a map of Peenemünde and indicating where things were still standing, not been hit. And keep in mind, in those days we weren't able to just take photographs of what's going on. So this information was really quite helpful. And I took it all, thanked him, and made sure that I knew Kempte's address. And then we got in touch with Air Force Intelligence A2 in London and told them we had this person from Peenemünde who is prepared to talk about where we hit and where we have missed. And the answer we got was, just make sure you stay in touch with him. We're going to have 2 people there in 12 hours. And sure enough, 12 hours later, the guys from London arrived, and we had the MPs bring in the person whom I had interrogated, and we linked them up with the people from London, and they went off with him and spent, I think, about 2 hours with him. And after that, I got a call from them. They said, "You've hit a gold mine. We're taking him back to London."
Beautiful.
As I look back at my career, it seems to me that was really a high point.
That is a critical moment.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Congratulations. That was, and the fact that they followed up on it, I'm slightly amazed at, but they got it done.
Yeah, it was, they took him to London to keep him there.
To fully debrief, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Schifter, let's take a quick break there. We'll be right back with the rest of your story on Veterans Chronicles.
Okay.
We are back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by Richard Schifter, a U.S. Army veteran of World War II, one of the Ritchie boys, and he just told us a fascinating story about one of the Germans that he interrogated and the critical information that it provided for the Allies. That's just an amazing story. What was your general observation of most German soldiers you interrogated? Were most like him, that he either wanted the war to be over or didn't want to be captured by the Russians? Did most of them support the Third Reich? Did most of them feel like they had no choice? How would you describe it?
As a matter of fact, I've previously mentioned my interrogation of this German soldier who first didn't want to tell me what army unit he belonged to. It so happens that when I first started asking for his name, and he gave me his name, it was very clear to me that he spoke with an Austrian accent. So I asked him where he came from, and he said, Upper Danube. That was the name that the Nazis gave to a province in Austria. It had usually been called Upper Austria. And I then said to him, again in German, I said, Upper Austria is what you mean. He looked at me very sternly and said, Upper Danube. It was clear to me at that particular point that he was very much committed there, and that is when he then refused to name the unit that he belonged to until I warned him about turning him over to the Russians. That was this one case. By the time we got to West Germany and talked both to soldiers and civilians, it was very interesting how many of them recognized that the war was going to be lost by them. It was over, and what they wanted to do was to just cooperate and bring the end of the war closer. That was the general attitude there.
Now, after the war, you left the service in, I believe, 1946, but you stayed on as a civilian in Germany. What kind of work were you doing?
I joined the finance division of the Office of Military Government for Germany, and was assigned to the external assets branch. The responsibility of the external assets branch was to find out what assets German companies had in foreign countries. And in many cases, these were assets whose ownership had been cloaked. And it was a matter of investigating that and making it very, and then arranging for these assets to be appropriately dealt with, which meant ultimately that they would be made available to the Allied powers for restitution, essentially.
And this is also the time you discovered what had happened to your family, correct?
I had assumed that somewhat earlier, but yes, during this period it became clear to me also when I checked further as to what had happened in the area where my parents last lived. Yes.
Now, after you came home from Germany, you went to law school and had a distinguished legal career for over 3 decades. And then in the early 1980s, you were brought back to serving your country, specifically at the United Nations. Explain what your work was there.
Representing the United States at the United Nations.
Yes.
Yes. I was asked by a good friend of mine who had become the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Jean Kirkpatrick, to serve in Geneva representing the United States in the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And that is what I did for a number of years. I then was asked again by her to go to New York and serve as one of the deputies in the Security Council of the United Nations. And that's what I did for a year. Then after that, I served as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and then also on the National Security Council staff, and again in the State Department Special Assistant. Altogether, I spent 20 years from 1981 to 2001 in various administrations in the U.S. government in dealing with foreign policy.
How did your experience, both personally and in the military, in dealing with perhaps the worst human rights regime we've ever seen, or at least one of them, how did that impact your work on human rights years later?
Well, let me put it this way, I was highly conscious of all these problems and applied myself to the task of correcting them. And as a matter of fact, I spent a great deal of time in the years from 1987 to 1991 on effecting changes in the Soviet Union. And one of the tragedies is that things have gone worse again. The work done under the leadership of George Shultz in working, the Secretary of State, in working with and effecting changes in the Gorbachev administration were quite significant.
How did you do that? How did you affect change, and what were those changes?
We dealt with a number of matters. Number one, it was a matter of getting them to release political prisoners and stop prosecuting people for political crimes, changing the laws. Number two, they had used what became known at the time as abuse of psychiatry, committing a good many political dissenters to mental institutions and treating them as people who were mentally ill. And that was second matter, and then again for them to stop this. And number three, it was a matter of getting them to change the rules with regard to granting exit permits to citizens of the Soviet Union to allow them to leave the country. Most of the people who wanted to leave were Jews, but there were also quite a number of evangelical Christians and others who wanted to leave, and that was made possible as a result of the work we did. And specifically, what happened was that we were able to persuade the Soviet officials under the leadership of Gorbachev at that time to transfer responsibility for what really had been domestic issues to the foreign ministry. And the foreign ministry under Shevardnadze became very much involved in accommodating us. And as a matter of fact, after he had no longer been in office, I had a conversation with Shevardnadze as to how all of that worked. And the one thing I still remember his telling me was that getting the sort of old-time people who still wanted to maintain the Stalinist approach to just go along was made possible by the fact that we were stepping up at a certain point in the 1980s, our allocation of gross national product to defense from 5% to 7%. And he said, we were at 20%, we couldn't go any higher. And he said that persuaded these guys who did not want to go along with Gorbachev under other circumstances just to accept that. As far as Shevardnadze himself is concerned, I really think he had been committed to a fundamental change in the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union, as was Gorbachev. So the two of them really tried to move it forward. And again, a number of situations where I was involved in calling the attention of the foreign ministry to certain problems, to the possibility that they may have an engagement, and the result of that was that they did become engaged in matters that, as I say, were otherwise handled by other parts of the government, and then foreign ministry wanted to work with us, and they did.
Sir, just a couple minutes left. When you think about your military service or your diplomatic service, what are you most proud of?
Well, as I say, I told you before about the Peenemünde.
Yes.
That was my high point in the Soviet Union, in World War II. As far as my diplomatic work is concerned, a number of things let me just mention one story. I got to Moscow in September 87. We had Shevardnadze was supposed to come to Washington and meet with George Shultz to deal with arms reduction. And I decided I think I should go ahead and see whether I can work some things out, including the matter of the immigration issues. So I went there in August 87, and when I went to the foreign ministry, I was greeted in a very friendly fashion and said, we have set up a meeting for you at the section of the Interior Ministry that is responsible for granting exit permits. So I went there, and I had a list of names that I wanted to discuss with so-called refuseniks, people who had applied for exit visas and had been turned down. And they were willing to talk to me about those who wanted to migrate to the United States. When I came up with the people who wanted to migrate to other countries, I was told, that's none of your business. We're not going to talk about that. And I then tried to make the point, but you have a legal obligation under the treaties that you have signed to release people. He said, we're not going to discuss that with you. So I went back to the foreign ministry, and I said, when I was asked, how did you do with the Interior Ministry, I was told that I then said, done very badly there. And I want to tell you, when I report on that to Secretary Shultz, it's certainly going to be something he will raise with Mr. Shevardnadze, with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, when he comes to Washington to discuss various other issues of concern to both of us. I was I didn't get an answer to that, but it was registered that I had been concerned and that I was going to report this to Secretary Schultz. The next day, I was leaving for Warsaw, was at the airport, and somebody from the Foreign Ministry was there, greeted me, made sure I got into the VIP lounge, brought me a cup of tea, and then sat next to me and said, that list that you wanted to give to the Interior Ministry yesterday, please give it to me. We're going to look at it. When I then sent a message back to Washington about that last item, I said that I was quoting from Secretary Rusk, who at the end of the when it seemed that like the Cuban Missile Crisis was ending, said, I think the other side has just blinked. And sure enough, during the meeting in September, somebody from the Foreign Ministry who had been specifically designated to talk to me reported to me that the Interior Ministry's decision has been reversed, and from now on they were going to start issuing these exit permits. And sure enough, the people on that list got got their exit permits in October of '87, and the next few years, about 1.5 million Jews left Russia under this policy that was initiated just when we had this meeting in August 1987.
Wonderful. That's a lot of progress in a short period of time. Richard, a fascinating career, a fascinating service to our nation in many different ways. So thank you so much for your great patriotism, and thank you for being with us today.
Great. Thank you.
Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles has been Richard Schifter, a U.S. Army veteran of World War II, one of the Ritchie boys. Later served as a diplomat holding several different roles for the United States at the United Nations and State Department. I'm Greg Columbus. This has been Veterans Chronicles.